If we're talking about RPGs that came out in 2020, the first games that'll come to your mind are probably stuff like Final Fantasy VII Remake, or Persona 5 Royale, or maybe even Cyberpunk 2077 if you want to count that. And while these games are all fucking cracked, you know, some of them in a more literal sense, there's one particular role-playing game that came out in 2020 which I feel deserved way more attention than it actually got, and gave me more enjoyment than any other RPG that year, and that game is Yakuza 7. Like a dragon. Before I start, I just want to say that if you're a fan of the Yakuza series and are already planning to play this game, then I actually recommend watching this after you've finished the game, because even though I won't really talk about the story, I am going to be spoiling some gameplay mechanics as well as some of the side shit, and I honestly feel that the less you know about the game, the more fun you'll have with it. But if you're kind of on the fence about the direction they're taking the series, or you're not really familiar with it and are just thinking about getting into this game, then this video is for you, and hopefully by the end you'll know why I love this game so much. So get nice and comfortable and keep your hands and legs in the ride at all times, because if the length of my previous video is anything to go by, this is probably gonna take a while. Looking at Yakuza 0 to 6, especially the newer games, you can already kind of see a lot of RPG elements inside, and if you think about it, the fact that they finally decided to double down on those elements and fully commit to making the game a turn-based RPG has actually kind of been a long time coming. Because think about it, right? Which genre of games allows you to level up and upgrade your character, has a bunch of side quests and other wacky shit you can do, and is always very story-driven? Yeah, what was it called again? Just something like roly-poly game or some shit. A lot of skepticism I've seen about this game from fans of the series is due to the decision they made to replace the old beat-em-up action combat system with a turn-based one. But I actually think that this choice opens up way more possibilities to bring the open world of the game with all the side activities and the main story a lot closer, which I'll get more into after I finish talking about the combat itself. Getting turn-based combat right is always a tricky thing to do because it is by nature a lot less engaging than dynamic combat. Like, it's pretty difficult to argue that navigating a menu is more fun than running around and beating people up, but some of the best RPGs out there manage to find a way to spice up their turn-based system. Think of it as sauce you put on spaghetti. Like, here's this plain-ass turn-based system. On its own, it doesn't taste very good, but with enough extra flavor, it can become something that tastes a lot better. Persona 5 is one of my favorite JRPGs, even though I honestly feel that its combat is objectively kind of mediocre, but the sauce it uses is like an illusory one to kind of distract you from noticing that, because look at the fucking animations and the UI, and oh my god, everything looks so fucking cool on the music, man! But due to all these flashy things being there, even if you don't like turn-based combat, the battles are still at the very least bearable enough for you to get through them and be able to appreciate the other stronger aspects of the game. You also got games like Darkest Dungeon, which are like, oh, did I say I was putting sauce on this spaghetti? I actually meant fucking melted down mental stimulants. Because almost every move you make matters, and one fuck up can potentially ruin the entire expedition. Even though you technically have all the time in the world to decide what you want to do, you're still constantly shitting yourself going like, god shit, you know, is my guy gonna fucking die if I do this? And this is kind of how strategy-focused games manage to be consistently engaging and enjoyable in a different way from how people normally enjoy action games. And while these two types of sauces are great in their own ways, Yakuza 7 uses a different, super secret sauce to beef up its turn-based system. Chrono Trigger is regarded as one of the best games of all time, and the reason why its combat holds up so well for a lot of people is because not only does it have all the usual shit you see in turn-based games like enemy resistances and weaknesses, it adds another layer of interactivity to make the system still be partially dynamic by having the enemies move around. And because the enemies aren't static and a lot of your attacks have AoE effects, the positioning of the enemies actually matters when you do shit, so not only does it constantly make you think about what to do, you also have to time your shit properly and actually pay attention to what's happening on the screen. It's a very simple concept on paper, but to me, in recent times, no other game has truly been able to replicate this elusive but also extremely delicious sauce of dynamic elements and mix it in properly with its turn-based combat besides Yakuza 7 and Faster Than Light, which this video is not about, but is also a pretty good game. In a very similar way to Chrono Trigger, the positioning of the enemies matters when you're making your move in Yakuza 7 because games, there are many mechanics that reward you for paying attention to where the enemies are standing. You got big bongo skills that hit in an area, enemies will be like, nah bitch, if you try and hit someone behind them. Ichiban can pick up certain objects if they are near his target and beat the shit out of them with said object. But over and above this, my favorite mechanic that they included is the perfect guard system, where if you press circle right as you're getting hit by an enemy, the damage you take will be greatly reduced. And the reason why I think it's so great is because not only does it remove a lot of the usual downtime during enemy turns, it also rewards you for memorizing the different attack patterns of enemies and bosses, or you know, just having fucking insane reaction times. One particular thing that I really like a lot about this mechanic is that some enemies and bosses actually have movesets and animations that you will recognize from the previous games in the series if you've played them before. So if you're an old fan and remember what the animations look like, you'll know the timing to perfect guard them as well, which I think is one of the coolest ways I've ever seen fan service in a video game. So apart from the non-static enemies and the perfect guard system, you also have standard QTEs that you can perform while using skills for them to do extra damage. This is probably the least interesting mechanic out of the three, but I get what they were trying to do. It's like, you know, you do the heat actions in the old games and then you press the buttons. But basically these things are what really make the combat consistently fun for me, because even though it's just these three seemingly simple mechanics, they come into play during pretty much every fight. Now at this point, some of you might be going like, okay Einstro, that's really cool and all, but I'm more relaxed when it comes to video gaming, you know, I don't really like having to time my button presses and shit when it comes to turn-based games. I just want to sit back and hit A or X or whatever the fuck you press on this fucking controller, and that's actually perfectly fine. Not just in my opinion, but in this game's opinion as well. All the things I just mentioned are kind of there on top of a standard turn-based system that is playable without those extra elements. If you really wanted to, you could just ignore every single QTE and not perfect guard anything. The game is still playable that way, because while these mechanics are there to reward you for having better timing and paying more attention, they won't really punish you if you choose to ignore them. You can still eat the spaghetti with no sauce, even though it's kind of disgusting. Outside the battles themselves, there is also a pretty solid job system that lets you build your characters and have them learn new skills that they can use with any job. It's pretty standard stuff, kind of similar to what we've seen in some of the Final Fantasy games, but it's done surprisingly well. I actually had a shit ton of fun collecting different moves on my characters that were useful for the role that I wanted them to fill. Like for example, Nanba, he's kind of a magic guy, so you can make him a fortune teller and get this move that makes him go like Ikazuchi ya, and then he fucking shocks everyone. The usual problems with turn-based combat, however, are still somewhat present. There are a few bosses that are huge health sinks, and some fights that probably drag on for a bit longer than they should, but because of all the things they got right with the combat, and due to the fact that it's somewhat dynamic because it rewards you for reacting to what's happening on the screen, it feels a lot less tedious because the game is constantly trying to engage you. Overall, I think that for a turn-based system, Yakuza 7's combat is possibly one of the best I've ever played, which makes me really sad when I see old fans getting turned off just because they changed the combat, because they honestly did a really fucking good job. So now that we're done talking about spaghetti and sauce and whatever the hell I was saying, if we consider the sheer variety of content and side quests and mini games that are usually present in a standard Yakuza game, besides giving the player some experience points or maybe some consumable healing items and breakable weapons, how else can you motivate the player to experience as much of the optional content as possible and tie it to the core gameplay loop in an impactful and noticeable way? The diversity and wackiness of the side content has always been one of the main defining traits of the Yakuza series. Having started with Yakuza 6 followed by 0, I really enjoyed almost all of the sub-stories as well as the minigames, but when I was playing through 3 and 4 afterwards, I found myself caring a lot less about the side content and playing mostly just to experience the story. And after giving it some thought, I kind of came to the conclusion that there were two reasons for me losing interest in the side content. The first reason is that the initial hooks and overall writing for the sub-stories in the newer games are a lot better. There's one difference between the older and newer title sub-stories which may seem kind of minor, but I actually feel is quite important, and it's that in the newer games, more often than not, things will happen to you around town which lead into sub-stories, while in the older games, you have to manually trigger a lot of the sub-stories yourself by walking towards a marker and talking to someone. And I personally feel that the former way is much more effective at grabbing the player's attention, although there are some ways you can make the latter work as well. The second reason is that the rewards you get for doing side content are often either superficial or just completely non-existent. This is kind of an issue for me in every game from 0 to 6, although they did start making an effort to include more interesting rewards for some sub-stories after Yakuza 5, which is why I think that the main motivator for me and a lot of other people to explore the side content in Yakuza games has always been the wackiness and the writing, which I personally felt was a bit weaker in some of the older games. But even in the games where the sub-stories have more interesting narratives and premises, most of the side content has always felt kind of disjointed from what can be considered the main gameplay of progressing through the story and, beating up whoever the game throws at you. Like, karaoke's fun and the songs are all really good, bowling's pretty cool, darts is okay. I don't like mahjong, but all the side content is fun and cool on its own, but they feel like they're separate from the main game because they don't really affect your character or anything in the world in any way. And there's really nothing wrong with that. It's fine if they're just there as extra content. My point here, however, is that with the new direction Yakuza 7 went in, there's now a lot more potential for all this side content to be more connected to the main game. Remember how in Skyrim there are a bunch of quests that give unique and useful rewards like the Daedric artifacts and the dragon priests that you can hunt down to collect their masks, and the occasional word wall in a side dungeon or area that you can learn a shout from? These are all great things that game uses to reward the player in a meaningful way for exploring the game's side content, because their character will become noticeably stronger or gain an extra ability that will benefit them throughout the rest of the game. But what's important to note about this is that this is only really effective and possible for such a huge amount of content because the game is a full-fledged RPG. Yakuza 0 actually made a lot of good attempts at something like this, the most notable ones being Kiryu's Real Estate as well as Majima's Cabaret Club, which unlocked a new fighting style for them to use. But with the old beat-em-up system, most of your progression came from character upgrades that were purchased with EXP or money, which didn't leave a whole lot of options for them to reward the player with anything apart from weapons or equipment that were never really that impactful or necessary to begin with. But now that 7 is a turn-based RPG with stats and an equipment system that actually matters, they're able to take this concept and implement it on a much larger scale. In 7, not only is there still that quality writing we've all come to love and expect from the sub-stories in the series, a lot of them now also reward you with something special that you can use in combat or impact the game's world in some way. It's hard to talk more about this without spoiling the absolute shit out of the sub-stories, which I really don't want to do, so I'm just gonna give one very brief example. There's a particular sub-story that starts out with Ichiban throwing a crawfish into a river, which somehow leads into a whole mess that you have to solve, but after you finish this sub-story, you gain the ability to use that same crawfish as a summon in battle to poison your enemies. And that is the coolest shit ever. The whole game is just filled with fun rewards like this, and I fucking love it. Apart from the sub-stories, the usual minigames also now have added benefits that impact the core gameplay in some way. There's actually a bonding system for Ichiban and his party members which will unlock cutscenes and grant bonuses, which is actually, unironically, kind of like Persona. Dude, he's wearing red color. You look like a Persona 5. And if you participate in a minigame together with a party member, it'll actually increase your bond with them. There are a lot of other unique prizes and benefits you can get from doing minigames, and I think it's great that they finally managed to make everything more interconnected and that I can now actually get something out of singing Machine Gun Kiss 500 times. Machine Gun Kiss, then just fall in love. Whoa, whoa, whoa. So now that we've all had some time for our eardrums to recover, I'd like to start talking about the next most prominent thing people tend to know Yakuza games for, which are their story and their characters. To start off, I suppose I should address the elephant in the room, the elephant being, of course, a man whose name is Kasuga Ichiban. Like many fans of the series, I was initially kind of skeptical about the change in main characters, although I was already expecting it given how 6 was supposed to conclude Kiryu's role in the story, as mentioned in an interview with producer Nagoshi Toshihiro. Because Kiryu has been around for so long and has had his character develop so much, the next main character would have some fucking huge shoes to fill, which is why I was very surprised when they initially announced that they would be replacing him with someone completely new instead of another protagonist that's already been established. Because we already got guys like Majimi and Seijimi and even Akiyomo. These guys are all pretty well liked and are quite involved with the overall story, which actually makes them pretty good candidates for a new main character. So when I booted up Yakuza 7 for the first time, I was like, well shit RGG Studio, if you're gonna choose this guy with this haircut over all these other dudes that I already like, then you better know what you're fucking doing. And within the first hour, the game was like, yeah, we know what we're fucking doing, you little bitch. I think that although it was a big risk to replace such a beloved character like Kiryu with someone completely new, what allows Ichiban to really stand out is actually the fact that he's so different from anyone we've ever played as before, and because of this he's able to offer a completely new perspective on the world of the game. Don't get me wrong, all these guys we've played as before are still cool as shit, but they all kind of fall into a similar category because they're already established within the world of the game in some way. Yakuza 0 introduces you to Kiryu with a scene of him beating the shit out of someone. Like, even if you don't know who he is from the other games, you can already tell that this is a scary man. Saejima has his whole 18 counts thing, Akiyama has more money than Bill Gates, even Tanimura and Shinada, although he seems like kind of a loser at first, are well known for something. The fact that Ichiban is just a regular guy in the Tojo clan instead of some famous serial killer or moneylender, combined with having a majority of the game take place in Ijincho, which is unfamiliar territory for both him and the player, actually makes him feel a lot more vulnerable and relatable, and it's a lot easier to put yourself in his shoes than it is with any protagonist we've ever played as. And yes, I know that was a very roundabout way of just saying that this game makes you feel like Ichiban, but it really does. You spend pretty much the entire prologue running around being an errand boy or being bossed around by other people, which doesn't sound very nice when I say it like this, but is actually a pretty fresh perspective for the series. For the first time ever, it really felt like I was playing as just one of those shitty thugs that go up to Kiryu and then say some shit in Japanese like "Osan hake," and then Kiryu's like "Koukai suru na." If their goal was to create an entirely new adventure starting from scratch set in the universe of the Yakuza series, then I'd honestly say they thoroughly succeeded. Yakuza 0 was an amazing prequel and origin story for both Kiryu and Majima, but I still feel that the events that truly defined Kiryu as a character mostly took place in 1, and that I never really felt super vulnerable or weak when playing as the two protagonists in 0, which isn't even really a bad thing, but the point here is that the experience you get from playing 7 isn't something that you can really find in any of the other games that already exist. I won't really talk much about 7's story because I don't want to get into spoilers for this video, but if I had to sum it up, 7 is really a tale about starting from rock bottom and fighting your way up to the top. And in the end, I feel that the reason why the game was able to commit to this theme so well in terms of gameplay is, again, because they decided to make it an RPG. It can be as simple as seeing your characters level up or gaining access to new parts of the map. All these little things combined make the growth these characters go through as their crazy-ass journey unfolds a lot more tangible to you as the player. What's interesting is that the game actually makes money an extremely scarce resource during the beginning, and in my playthrough when I went to the arcade during the early game, I ran out of money playing with the claw machine. And for the very first time, I actually felt like I was limited with what I could do in the world, which might sound pretty bad on paper, but once you get past that stage of the game and are much stronger and have more money, when you look back to those times, it feels like you truly earned your freedom, and that's something I've never really felt before when playing a Yakuza game, which is pretty ironic considering a large portion of Saejima's gameplay. The last thing I want to say is more for old fans of the series, which is that while it's true that this is kind of a fresh story that's more friendly towards new players who know nothing about the previous games, only the returning players will be able to truly appreciate all the callbacks and details that are there due to the older titles, and I think that you're truly missing out if you wrote this game off just because of the change in genre and combat system. Because although you're in a completely new area with a bunch of people you don't recognize, the game repeatedly makes it very clear that this is still a Yakuza game and that the legacy of all these old characters that you've grown to love is still there and still matters. There's such an insanely high payoff for returning players, and it makes me genuinely sad to see that so many old fans aren't willing to give the game a chance. To be very fair, this game still does suffer from one problem that many JRPGs have, which is long-ass cutscenes and dialogue, but the writing has always been one of the strongest points of the series, and it really helps to sort of make the downtime more bearable with good pacing and an interesting story. If there's one thing you should take away from this video, it's that not only is Yakuza 7 an amazing RPG, it's still also a really good Yakuza game, and when you put those two things together, you get a game that, at least in my opinion, is something truly special. Thank you so much for watching as usual. I'm sorry if this took a while to come out. I've been busy with a lot of things like school, and I've also been trying to explore more creative stuff. I hope you found this video at least a little bit insightful or entertaining, and if you want to see more content like this, then maybe hit the subscribe button or something, I don't know. It's up to you. I'm also open to suggestions on topics to make videos about, as long as there's something I'm knowledgeable enough to talk about. But yeah, Yakuza 7 is the best RPG of 2020 in my humble opinion, and I really just wanted to share my enjoyment of the game, which I hopefully managed to do with this video. Until we see each other again. 1億2億100億のキスを浴びせてやる Baby この腕抱いてお前も二度と話はしない Machine gun kiss they just fall in love Whoa, whoa.